lead senators. They're like a bunch of cats sometimes trying to herd cats, but nonetheless, we are responding to her leadership because she's doing a great thing, not just for the state of Maryland, but for the country and for the Senate, and we appreciate that. Mr. President, with that, I'll yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before beginning my remarks, let me ask unanimous consent that Rita Culp, a detail lead from the Environmental Protection Agency, the Committee on Appropriations, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of the 113th Congress, and Tiffany Taylor, a detail lead from the Department of the Interior to the Committee on Appropriations, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of the first session of the 113th Congress.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin where Senator Pryor left off, and that is to commend our chairwoman for extraordinary leadership, not only on behalf of her constituents, but for the nation. These are very difficult times, and we all feel much more confident because of her leadership, because of her commitment, because of her incredible and energetic advocacy for a common sense, common purpose in terms of not just our appropriations, but in terms of the way we conduct ourselves in the United States Senate. And so we're extraordinarily fortunate to have her leadership. And Mr. President, I'm here along with many of my colleagues to address these looming fiscal deadlines and, more importantly, how do we keep our economy growing and our jobs increasing? That is really why I believe we were sent here, not to engage in some of these procedural arguments, not to challenge basic presumptions and the history of our country, which we've always managed to keep, with some few exceptions, our government open, and with virtually no exceptions, we've paid our bills. And yet today, we are consumed by these debates when most every American in every corner of this country is asking us, what about our jobs? What about growth? What about the future for our children? So we have to go ahead and refocus on growing our economy, investing in our country, and part of that is to fund our government and to pay our debts, a big part of that. One other last point that should be made, too, is that the presumption that we are going to deny 30 million Americans health care is not going to help our economy. It won't create jobs. It'll do quite the opposite. It will set us back. It won't move us forward. We had a substantial debate. We passed legislation, but the Supreme Court of the United States declared the legislation constitutional, and we are going forward now, as most Americans want us to do, to deploy it, to fix it where it needs to be fixed, but not to use it as a political wedge for purely political means. For the first time, to achieve a dream of many people over many decades, that every American will have affordable access to health care. And by the way, to do what other nations have been able to do is to reduce the cost of health care so that we can afford it not just today, but in the generations ahead. And the idea that you would threaten a government shutdown to try to achieve this objective, I think, is something that is unfortunate and inappropriate. We are facing two fiscal deadlines, and they can be reduced to very simple questions. Do we fund the government, and do we pay the nation's bills? And my answer, and the answer of the vast majority of my constituents in Rhode Island, is simply yes, we do. We have to. We understand that we have to go ahead and have an economy that works and a government that helps that economy work. We have to be efficient and effective, but we can't leave simply to the mercies of the market and to the fates what happens in our economy. We have to take purposeful action, and that means we have to have a government that is prepared and able and resourced to act. Now, if there is a shutdown, if Republicans force a shutdown of the government, it'll have extraordinarily adverse consequences to thousands of Rhode Island workers, my constituents, people all across this country. it would hurt our economic growth, obviously. Rather than doing this, we should be working to expand our growth. We should be doing more to get people back to work. But we've heard in both chambers, Republicans in talking about another round of brinksmanship. We saw this in August of 2011, and the results there were palpable. It set back our economy. It suppressed job creation. It took what looked like a growing economic momentum, and it literally deflated that momentum. Our credit rating was downgraded. For the first time, I think in anyone's recollection, perhaps in history, it was a short-sighted political game that hurt people all across this country, and yet here we are again, apparently prepared to play the game. People do not want us to be gaming their futures, their children's futures. They want us to be helping them, investing in those futures in a positive and, we hope, collaborative effort of both sides. But we're back. Will we pay our bills by voting to raise the debt ceiling? Will we keep the government open and working so that we can help people who need help, so that we continue to research issues, so we continue to innovate, so we continue to build, literally, the country? We believe we must do this. This March, Senate Democrats passed a budget that set spending levels, responsibly replaced the sequester, reduced the deficit, and included a $100 billion targeted jobs and infrastructure package that would start creating new jobs quickly, begin repairing the worst of our crumbling roads and bridges, and help train our workers to fill 21st century jobs. The Republican-controlled House also passed a budget. It's in stark contrast to ours, but they have a budget too. So the basic constitutional approach, the basic procedural approach, is to bring those two budgets to conference, to iron out the differences, and to have a plan to go forward to fund the government and to meet our basic needs. But we can't do that because repeatedly Republicans here have objected to going to conference. Now, this is very ironic, since the refrain that you heard several years ago was the Senate Democrats have got a budget, they don't have a budget, etc. It was a pretty good political response. It ignored the fact that in the Budget Control Act of 2011 we actually set budget limits and effectively had a budget. But now it's sort of never mind. They've got a budget, but we don't want them to have, we don't want the Congress to have a budget. We need to pass a budget. We need to responsibly deal with sequestration. We have to create jobs and strengthen the middle class. Now, last Friday, the House Republicans played their latest card in this gambit that's extended over several years to achieve their political goals by holding the economy hostage. This time they want to defund health reform as a condition of keeping the government open. Indeed, a tactic I believe that many Republicans in this body have rejected, and I think sensibly rejected. And there's no doubt that if the House vision prevails, it will hurt our economy. It will reduce revenue. It will waste taxpayers' dollars. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the shutdowns in the mid-90s reduced GDP by 0.5%. Those episodes under the Clinton administration, again prompted with a political agenda, not an economic agenda, by the Republicans in the House, cost Americans jobs and growth. It's estimated that every week the government shut down, it will cost the economy about $30 billion. This is a very expensive political gambit, something that should be rejected on its face, but also rejected because of the adverse harm, the demonstrable economic harm it will do the country. So if you do care about the jobs and the economy, the last thing you want to do is shut the government down. First of all, it eliminates directly lots of people who work for the federal government, who pay taxes, who provide critical services. The secondary effects is they can't do their job, so other economic activities stall. And then the tertiary effect is that the local vendors in the communities who rely on the government contractors lose their business, and it is a downward spiral. And everyone here, particularly my colleagues who are chairmen and women of the Appropriations Subcommittees, recognize this. Senator Pryor was very articulate about some of the effects in the agricultural sector. I have the privilege of chairing the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee. And a shutdown would be very, very disruptive. For example, lease sales and permits for oil, gas, coal, and other minerals on federal lands and waters will be stopped. Processing onshore oil and gas drilling applications will stop. Processing applications for permits to drill offshore will stop. Review and approval of offshore exploration and development plans will stop. What will be the effect? Well, this will delay revenue, obviously, both for the federal government and for the private sector. For those private entrepreneurs who are out there investing their own capital to try to develop natural resources and provide them to the marketplace, they'll lose out too. Another example, public access to recreation and federal lands will virtually cease. The national parks, the national monuments, the national wildlife refuges will all be closed to visitors. Campgrounds and lodging, visitor centers, marinas, food services, and other concessions will be closed, with thousands of people without jobs. Businesses that operate in the parks as outdoor outfitters will not be able to access permitted areas. If you go to any national park, there is typically around it a group of small businessmen and women that provide backpacking gear, that provide rental of rafts and boats and outdoor equipment. What happens when the park closes? Their business goes to zero practically. And that's a consequence that is predictable, in fact, inevitable. There's another aspect to this government shutdown, too. While many federal employees will be furloughed, again, directly losing their pay, not contributing their tax dollars to the national economy, there are some who just can't be. In the Interior Department alone, thousands of federal workers will continue their jobs in order to protect life and property, but they won't be paid. This will include the Park Police. They were one of the first responses a few days ago to the Navy Yard shootings. Typical of their ethic of service and dedication to the country, they risked their lives, rushed to that place to try to protect fellow Americans. Those men and women of the Park Service Police will still stand guard, but they won't be paid. And it also includes park rangers who provide valuable safety. It would include tribal law enforcement officers for our tribal police departments, tribal child protection services, and the oil and gas inspectors who have to go out and make sure that existing operations are being conducted in a technically appropriate way. Turning to the EPA, Administrator Gina McCarthy has said, in her words, EPA effectively shuts down with only a core group of individuals who are there in the event of a significant emergency. EPA is planning to furlough approximately 95% of its total workforce. Staff will not be reviewing air, water, and hazardous waste permit applications or writing such permits. This will slow construction of new facilities and major improvements to existing ones, impacting jobs and impacting industry's overall willingness to plan investments. If you want to stop shrinking construction in the United States, major construction projects, then just take out the permitting process, nullify it, because they can't go forward legally without permits. Permits from EPA, permits from local regulators, and you will have a huge contraction. You will have projects that have been planned, that are going forward, that they'll put on hold, and it'll ripple through the economy. EPA, for example, also will stop certifying that manufacturers are complying with all vehicle emission standards. And without EPA certification, automakers will have a difficult time selling products in the United States. Here, one of the great examples of what the President's leadership has done, the revitalization of the American automobile industry, could be jeopardized simply because of the fact they can't have their vehicles certified because the EPA is basically closed. And a shutdown compounds the hidden costs of the sequester. It is an inefficient and blunt instrument, the sequestration. It forces the agencies to make drastic decisions that frustrate that mission, that do not allow them to prioritize, and it frustrates all of us, and it will complicate and compound our life going forward. You know, we're already feeling, put aside for the moment a potential government shutdown, we're already feeling the effects of the pending sequestration. We're seeing forced furloughs up in Rhode Island at the Newport Navy base and other facilities. And we're seeing the ripple effect of that. The local businesses, they're seeing demand go down, revenues go down, their financial viability being threatened. Rhode Islanders have been, who've been laid off in private enterprises and other enterprises through no fault of their own are seeing their unemployment insurance cut by the sequester already. The average weekly benefit of $377 is being cut by $46. The Rhode Island Department of Labor and Training estimates 6,000 to 7,000 Rhode Islanders are being affected, taking $1.4 million per month directly out of our economy. Our economy is still staggering, 9% unemployment. And this is something that is causing pain and hardship to families throughout my state. And we're now even cutting back on the very modest benefits that they might be receiving after losing their employment. Head Start, extraordinarily valuable program. It serves more than 2,400 children in my state. For fiscal year 13, the sequestration has reduced funding by $1.3 million, which is a big number when it comes to the smallest state and area in the country. To manage these cuts, staff has been laid off. Transportation has been reduced, other support services. But even with those savings, 370 slots, 370 children, don't call them slots, children will not get access to Head Start. That means in many cases their parents can't continue to work because they can't leave their child alone. And the problems become more and more complicated. These problems have profound implications, and they reach very far across the spectrum. And then there's one other point I want to make here, is that some people are saying, well, sequestration is bad, but we really just have to deal with the defense aspects of it, because, that's the most important thing. These other programs, they can go their way. Well, it was interesting, because Norm Augustine, who's one of the premier leaders in the defense industry, former chairman of Lockheed Martin, former undersecretary of the Army. He's served on so many different boards as one of the great sort of public servants as well as industrial leaders, the National Academy of Engineering, Defense Science Board, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Well, in a speech recently, Mr. Augustine said that much of the non-defense spending that people are sort of dismissing as unimportant is more critical to our national security or as critical as some of the defense programs. He talked about how today's youngest generation will be the first in history to be less well-educated than their parents if trends continue, and they're likely to be less healthy, particularly if we don't continue to support the health care improvements under the Affordable Care Act. One of the startling discoveries is the military, according to Mr. Augustine, is claiming that 70% of today's young people are ineligible for military service because of mental, physical, and moral shortcomings. Now, the mental and physical shortcomings are a function of two things, education and health care. And we're proposing to say, let's cut them. Let's drop this whole proposal about affordable care. And who will be the beneficiary of affordable care and better Head Start and better education? Probably those 70% of those young people who can't qualify to be recruits in the United States Army. So you think we have a problem with national defense. We do have a problem with defense. But it's not simply by buying more platforms, more ships, more planes. It's by having a generation of Americans who can stand up and serve. And Mr. President, I could go on, but I just simply want to say that we are in a situation where we have to basically do what we've always done. Stood up and said, we're going to keep the government moving. We're going to make choices about priorities, but we're going to keep our government open. And we'll debate those choices, and we'll debate those priorities, and we'll come to a conclusion, and we'll move forward. And oh, by the way, we're going to pay the debts we've already accumulated. The American people should understand, this is not like an initial, sort of offer of debt security.
The majority time has expired.
What I request an additional 30 seconds.
Without objection.
We're not going out there saying, listen, let us borrow some more money so we can spend this new money. We're just trying to pay for programs and appropriations that have been approved by the Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, both the House and the Senate. These are accumulated debts. Many of the debts were accumulated in the previous administration fighting 2 wars. We're not, and we shouldn't turn our back for the first time in our history in what we have voted previously to spend. And indeed, if we do that, it'll create chaos in economic markets. Chaos that we have never seen before, and the markets internationally are so fragile that we dare not risk this. And with that, Mr. President, excuse me, I would yield the floor.
President.
Republican whip.
Mr. President, before I begin my other remarks today, I would like to say a few words about my friend Arnold Garcia, who recently announced his retirement as editor of the Austin American-Statesman editorial page. During a time of political polarization in Washington and in Austin and other cities across the country, Arnold enjoys the respect and admiration of Republicans and Democrats alike. He's a veteran of the United States Army and the Texas National Guard. And he spent 40 years at the Austin American-Statesman, serving as head of the editorial page for more than 2 decades. One of the most prominent and influential journalists in Texas, Arnold has a deep love and respect for our state, his country, and the men and women who defend us. He is, by all accounts, a fair-minded reporter, which is saying something if you're in our business, because we know that there's a natural adversarial relationship between the press and elected officials. But I know everyone in Texas who knows Arnold agrees that he's a fair-minded reporter who's always made time to talk really to almost anyone, has always had an open door for those who wanted to have a discussion on virtually any topic. So I just wanted to say a few words today about Arnold Garcia. Arnold, I salute your pioneering accomplishments. I thank you for all of these years of your friendship, and I wish you and your family nothing but the best in this next chapter of your life. Mr. President, turning to the topic du jour, along with many of my Republican colleagues, I've spent the past several days discussing all of the negative consequences of Obamacare. I think it's important to remember that these are human consequences, not just about numbers. When taxes and premiums rise, when doctors are forced to drop their patients, when people lose their pre-existing insurance coverage, and when full-time jobs become part-time jobs, when our health care safety net is stretched to the breaking point, each of these has a profound impact on the lives of real people. That's especially true for the neediest and most vulnerable among us who rely on the safety net programs that the President's health care law is further weakening. To better appreciate the consequences of Obamacare, we should consider the following questions. First, what does Obamacare mean to a 28-year-old college graduate who can only find part-time work and who's living with his parents? Well, it means he will either pay higher insurance premiums or pay higher taxes, and it also means he'll have a harder time finding full-time employment and starting a career. The second question, what does Obamacare mean for a single mom who's insured through Medicaid, that safety net program I was talking about? Well, it means that her family's primary insurance program, a program that's already broken. For example, in my state, only one doctor out of every 3 will see a new Medicaid patient because it reimburses at such a low rate. So Medicaid is already failing to reliably deliver access to health care. But with Obamacare and the dumping of millions of additional people into this broken program, it means that this program will be flooded with millions of new beneficiaries. And it means that Medicaid will soon be even less effective at delivering access to quality health care to the most vulnerable people in our society, the very people it was designed to protect. Question number 3. What does Obamacare mean to a 70-year-old retiree who's enrolled in Medicare? Well, it means that fewer and fewer doctors will accept him or her as a patient. Again, because Medicare pays doctors at a fraction of what private health insurance pays in terms of reimbursements for their services. And it also means, Obamacare also means that unelected bureaucrats will soon be making decisions about whether they will get the care that their doctor believes they need. The fourth question is, what does Obamacare mean for a working family that's been receiving employer-provided health insurance from their small business? Well, it means they very easily could lose their existing coverage and get dumped into an Obamacare exchange. It means they could very easily find themselves paying higher premiums for lower quality insurance. The final question I would ask is, what does Obamacare mean for a small business owner with 49 employees? Well, it means they have a powerful incentive to keep below that 50 employee cap, which would then kick them over into the employer sanction if they don't provide government-approved health care for all their employees. So their incentive is to keep employment low, not hire any more workers because of Obamacare's extensive regulations and financial penalties. As we think about each of these questions, we should also think about what business owners across America are telling us, I dare say all of us, about Obamacare. For example, a small business owner named Linda Peters, who runs a radio communications company in Anchorage, Alaska, recently said that Obamacare's health insurance tax, quote, hurts our future and threatens the stability of the small business sector, close quote. In Arkansas, the owner of Little Rock Tours and Travel, a woman named Gina Martin, has said, quote, none of us really understand how we're going to continue to stay in business, close quote. And in Louisiana, the owner of Dot's Diner Restaurant Group, a gentleman by the name of Larry Katz, recently told a Senate committee that he was being forced, quote, forced to put 16 people out of work just to save himself from the negative effects of Obamacare, close quote. Then in North Carolina, a franchise holder of the popular Five Guys burger chain, a man named Mike Ruffer, has estimated that Obamacare will cost him roughly $60,000 additional dollars a year. Well, each of the business owners that I mentioned lives in a state with at least one Democratic senator who voted for Obamacare back in 2009. I want to emphasize once again, Mr. President, that Obamacare is not inevitable. Any law that Congress has Congress passes, it can repeal, it can amend, it can change. The members of this chamber now have an opportunity to correct the mistake that Senate Democrats made in 2009 when Obamacare passed on a party line vote. All Democrats voted for it, all Republicans voted against it, including me. Now we have an opportunity to stop this law before it does any more damage to people like those I mentioned and millions more across America. As if adding insult to injury, just yesterday we learned that the IRS has somehow now misplaced $67 million that was allocated to the Obamacare slush fund. And I dare say, given all of the money being pushed into the implementation of Obamacare, we can expect more stories like that in the weeks and months ahead unless Congress acts. As I said, I'm proud to say I voted against Obamacare 4 years ago because I simply did not see how it could possibly work. I was concerned about the higher taxes on hardworking American families like my constituents in Texas. I was concerned about the command and control of Washington, D.C. on all the health care decisions that should have been left to doctors and patients and families trying to work together to determine what's in the best interest of those individuals and those families. And yes, I was concerned that government would continue to cut reimbursements to providers, which would make it more and more likely that fewer and fewer doctors and hospitals could actually see Medicare or Medicaid patients. And I was concerned that Obamacare represented a statement and an attitude that Washington knows best and that nothing anybody else has done in innovative medical facilities around the countries, in different states, none of that matters because Washington really knows best. Many people had the audacity to say that even though Obamacare was unpopular when it was passed, that people would learn to love it. Sort of like when Social Security and Medicare were originally passed. Well, many of our Democratic colleagues who were responsible for giving us Obamacare have what we don't have often in life, and that is a second chance. And these Senate Democrats who voted for Obamacare, now having seen the sorts of stories and heard the sorts of stories that I just described, they now have a second chance to help save the American people from a looming disaster. When you have people like Senator Max Baucus, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, on which I serve, telling Kathleen Sebelius, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, that the implementation of Obamacare is like a train wreck, we ought to listen. When some of the biggest cheerleaders for Obamacare, like organized labor, are now traveling to the White House and saying, please, Mr. President, won't you give us a waiver or exemption because this is turning out different than you told us it would. Full-time work, the 40-hour work week is in jeopardy because in order to protect themselves from employer sanctions, people are moving people from full-time work to part-time work, which is or if they can hire people at all, which may be one reason why the labor participation rate, which is a percentage of Americans who are actually in the workforce looking for work, is the lowest it's been in the last 30 years. As I said earlier, each of these stories is a human tragedy, and the stories behind the numbers, I think, tell a very sobering tale. But we are not powerless to deal with this looming disaster, with this impending train wreck, as Senator Baucus said, and I hope Senate Democrats will vote with Senate Republicans and take a stand, as we will have a chance to do when we get a chance to vote to defund Obamacare on the continuing resolution. And if we do, we will be protecting the American people from one of the most unpopular, unworkable, and unaffordable laws in modern history. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I'd like to elaborate on the comments of my colleague from Texas, who I think laid out in very clear terms what's at stake in the debate that we're having here, and really what the vote that we're going to have here in the not-too-distant future means. Because I think it's pretty clear, if you look at any objective measurement, any metric, that Obamacare is a huge disaster. And obviously we've seen tremendous anecdotal evidence of that. You travel your state or around the country, you talk to anybody who is in business, and the message comes back very clear that Obamacare is making it more difficult and more expensive for them to create jobs. It's creating a lot of uncertainty. There are mandates and requirements associated with the new law because employers are being forced to provide a government-approved plan, and so costs go up. That means there are people that aren't getting hired that otherwise might have gotten hired, companies that are looking at reducing their workforce, and obviously just creating a tremendous amount of disruption in our economy. And I think it's pretty evident that the middle class in particular is being crushed by the President's policies, and Obamacare is certainly no exception. Yesterday, we saw in Forbes magazine, Avik Roy reported on a recent study that was done by the Manhattan Institute that Obamacare will increase insurance rates for younger men by an average of 97% to 99% and for younger women by an average of 55% to 62%. Well, in my home state of South Dakota, that is more than just a statistic. It is a grim reality facing thousands of young men and women. By comparing a typical low-cost plan for a healthy 30-year-old in South Dakota this year with a bronze plan in South Dakota's health care exchange next year, the premium increases, Mr. President, are staggering. Younger women are going to face a 223% premium increase, and younger men are going to face a 393% premium increase when you compare new data from the Health and Human Services Department with data that came out from the Government Accountability Office about premiums in my state just this year earlier in January. So for those millennials in South Dakota, that's a $1,500 increase in health care premiums each year for women and more than a $2,000 increase in health care premiums for men. So the money that could be used, for other things is now going to be going toward this increase in health insurance premiums that people are going to have to pay to get covered. So they could have been using that to pay off a student loan. They could have been using it to save for a home or to start a family. And so this has a tremendous impact on the economy, and particularly those who are going to get hardest. In my state of South Dakota, not unlike other states around the country, it's young people, younger men and younger women. Now, interestingly enough, the administration and the President are out talking about how the HHS study or report confirms what they've been saying, that somehow premiums are going to go down. Well, the reason they are saying that, Mr. President, is they are comparing the exchange premiums, what they think people are going to pay, with what CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, predicted they might pay earlier this year. And so it's a hypothetical, it's a mythical comparison. There's nothing to it. It's fiction, if you will. And so what you've got to do is make this real for people. And when you make it real, when you compare it to what they are paying today, young people in particular are going to see dramatic increases in their premiums. And so the study was a complete, or the report was a complete fraud in terms of giving and informing people real information about what their health insurance premiums are going to be under these exchanges. And as I just pointed out, when you compare what they would be paying under the exchanges in my state of South Dakota with what people are paying today for similar type coverage, the increases are staggering. 223% premium increase for younger men and for younger women, and 393% increase for younger men. Now, they're going to say, well, some of these individuals are going to be eligible for premium tax credits to help cover the increased cost. But not everyone is eligible for those premium tax credits. There are going to be a lot of people who are not going to be eligible for the credits, and those credits don't cover all the cost. According to a new analysis by Avalere Health, Americans could face steep cost-sharing requirements like co-payments, co-insurance, and deductibles layered on top of the monthly premiums, which are going to increase dramatically. It is clear that health care costs are going up, particularly for younger Americans. Now, President Obama promised that health care premiums would go down by an average of $2,500 per family. If you look at what the real situation is with regard to families, Mr. President, those premiums have actually jumped by more than $2,500 since the President took office and since Obamacare became law. So we've got costs that continue to increase despite the President's promises to the contrary. Household income has been dropping since the time the President's been in office, about $3,700 according to a recent study. And so when you sit there and if you're an American family and you're looking at your economic situation, you're saying, now let me get this straight. I have higher costs and lower incomes. How does the President suspect that we're going to be able to cover these higher costs? Well, that's the reality, as I said, that most Americans are dealing with, and that people in my state of South Dakota, particularly as millennials, who are going to be most adversely and harmfully impacted by the new plan, are going to be dealing with. Now, with respect to jobs, the other thing I'd like to point out, because obviously the cost of health care is a very, very important situation and something that every American has to think about as they think about their own personal economic circumstances. But you also have to have jobs, and most people get health insurance coverage, a lot of them do, through their job. Well, what is the Obamacare legislation doing to jobs and to our economy? Nearly 3 in 4 small businesses plan to fire workers or to cut hours as a result of Obamacare. According to Investors Business Daily, more than 250 employers have cut jobs or slashed hours as a direct result of Obamacare's high-cost and job-killing regulations. Now, the other thing that's important to point out is 60% of the jobs that have been created this year, 60% of the jobs created this year are part-time jobs, not full-time jobs, part-time jobs, because the way the Obamacare legislation and the law is structured, it is a disincentive for companies to grow, because if they get bigger, if they get more than 50 employees, they're subject to a lot of these new regulations and mandates and requirements that they provide government-approved health care. There is also a definition in the law of what a full-time employee is. So if you are someone who works more than 30 hours, you're a full-time employee. So what are companies doing, businesses doing? They're hiring more and more people to work 29 hours a week. The President's probably going to go down in history as the President who created the most part-time jobs, but Americans want full-time jobs. They want to be able to have a job that allows them to make ends meet for their families, to plan for their children's education and for their own retirement, and having to work more than one job, multiple part-time jobs, just doesn't get it done for them. And so that's why we see this trend occurring of part-time jobs being created, largely because of mandates imposed in Obamacare. The middle class is being squeezed from both ends. Americans' premiums are going up while their hours and take-home pay are going down. The jobs impact are as clear across the country as they are in my state of South Dakota, but I want to give you one example of a South Dakota business owner who was recently interviewed. And he was asked in that interview about the higher costs and mandates of Obamacare, and this is what he said, and I'll quote, "You'll just have to adjust accordingly, and you'll have to cut jobs. And you probably won't hire as many people. And I think you'll see a lot of that." End quote. That's a small business owner in my state of South Dakota responding to a question about the impact of Obamacare on his ability to hire people, to create jobs, and to help expand his business and grow the economy in my state. Now, it's no wonder, Mr. President, that the President's approval rating is underwater. Nearly 60% of Americans say they oppose Obamacare, and it is the President's signature accomplishment. And so while the President's signature, the support for the President's signature law continues to fade, we're also seeing that it's impacting the President's personal approval rating. For the first time more Americans view the president unfavorably than they do favorably. And according to yesterday's Gallup poll, the president's struggling with his own base. Support among Democrats has dropped 13 points since December of 2012. I say all that to point out, Mr. President, that the effects of these policies, and particularly Obamacare in the specific, is having an impact on the president's standing, and I think that people are understanding what the impacts are, what the effects of this are, what the results of this are, and they're starting to react accordingly. Now, the other thing I guess I would mention, which is of great concern, I think, to anybody who is thinking about going into an exchange or looking to this next week when the exchanges, quote, go live or go online, is that there are an awful lot of glitches and bumps. You've got, as I said, premiums on the rise, workers' jobs, wages, and hours are being cut, and glitches and bumps when it comes to implementation. The latest example of an Obamacare glitch comes from the District of Columbia exchanges. A report that came out just yesterday said the District of Columbia Obamacare exchange is experiencing, and I quote, a high error rate. A high error rate, Mr. President, in calculating the tax credits that low and middle income people are going to receive. You can't make this stuff up. The government-run exchange is rendering, and I quote, a high error rate in handling your health care. Well, who would have thought that that would be the case? These exchange shoppers are not going to have access to the premium prices now until mid-November. It's according to that recent report on the District of Columbia. Well, there's similar glitches happening at the federal level as well, and in other states. Oregon and Colorado have faced setbacks. Reuters reports on Monday, and I quote again, employees running Connect for Health Colorado told board members that the exchange would not be able to calculate federal subsidies either, at least for the first few weeks, end quote. Inaccuracies, glitches, malfunctions mean this law is not ready for prime time. And meanwhile, we've got top Democrats here in the Congress who I think are in complete denial. The President said earlier this summer, I think it's important for us to recognize and acknowledge that this is working the way it's supposed to. Representative Pelosi on the House side said the implementation of this is fabulous. Senator Reid said on Meet the Press here not too long ago, Obamacare has been wonderful for America. Well, that message is being lost on Americans, Mr. President. We have an opportunity to correct that. We get a chance at a do-over here. We can fix this. We can correct this wrong. We can do this in a much better way. It didn't take a 2,700-page bill and 20,000 pages of regulations to fix the problems that we have in our health care system today. But what we have now is a government takeover of 1/6 of our economy, and we are seeing what that means for many Americans. Higher premiums, higher costs, fewer jobs, lower take-home pay, glitches and bumps when it comes to implementation. At a minimum, Mr. President, what we ought to do is delay the implementation of this, not just for a favored few, not just for those select constituencies that the President wants to grant waivers and exemptions, but we ought to allow a delay of this for all Americans because it is not ready for prime time. And I think ultimately maybe what, drives or motivates people to stay with us in spite of all this, every day news stories, news organizations, headlines talking about the flaws, the errors in implementation, the, promises that were made by the administration when it comes to what costs were going to be for people and whether or not they'd be able to keep their own insurance. But when you look at all that, the cumulative effect of all that, the wise thing I think for us to do is to recognize that this was a mistake and at a minimum, delay its implementation. At the best, my favorite scenario would be that we repeal it and we start over. But I think we've got a lot of people here, as was mentioned by Senator Reid not too long ago, whose goal really is to get to a single-payer system. And if that's your goal, then you want this thing to muddle along and get so bad that the only alternative people are left with is a single-payer system. In other words, socialized medicine. And I don't think that's consistent with what the American people want, and certainly not consistent with our history and heritage of freedom and competition and giving people in this country more choices. And that might explain why many of the things that we have proposed, alternatives that we have proposed on this side of the aisle, consistently get voted down. State lines create interstate competition. That drives prices down. Why don't we allow pooling for small businesses so that they can get the benefit of group purchasing power? Why don't we reduce the cost of defensive medicine by ending junk lawsuits in this country? Why don't we allow people to have their own refundable tax credit so they can buy their own health insurance and come up with a system that's portable, that creates competition, that allows people to have more choices, that is based upon market impulses and market principles. When you got a free market and it's working, Mr. President, you get much lower costs because competition brings that about. Well, I hope we can get to that point where we say that this was the wrong direction. We're going to have a chance to vote on that later today. The vote that's going to be before us, and I'm not aware of any Republican in this chamber who's not going to vote to defund Obamacare. We have an opportunity as Republicans and Democrats to acknowledge what the American people have already recognized, and that is that this is not working. It's not working as it was intended. It's not working as planned. And the best thing that we can do is to acknowledge that, give the American people a break, give the American economy a break by delaying its implementation, and more importantly, just repealing it and starting over and doing this the right way, building upon the strengths that we have in our health care delivery system today, acknowledging that there are challenges and weaknesses, but things that can be fixed without passing a 2,700-page bill and 20,000 pages of regulations. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Senator from Arkansas.
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate the Senator from South Dakota and his words, but also his leadership, not only in this area, but in so many areas that of such importance that are facing our nation. So again, we appreciate him very, very much. With the exchanges set to open in a matter of days, we're getting an up-close and personal look at just how bad this law is for Arkansans. On Monday, the Obamacare premiums were released for the Arkansas exchanges. The exchanges were supposed to provide choices. The President said it would be like booking travel on Expedia. Do you know how many insurance companies you can pick from in El Dorado and Magnolia? 2. In Pine Bluff, Helena, and Lake Village? 2. In Jonesboro and Hot Springs? 3. There aren't a lot of options, and none of them are affordable. Sticker shock, I think, is the best way to describe the response I've heard from Arkansans. Yesterday, a caller to my Fort Smith office said he could barely afford his diabetic medicine. With the new premiums, he simply can't afford it. That's one example of many similar calls that we have received and are receiving. With a price tag of nearly $3 trillion, the law creates more problems than it solves. It drives up health care costs, busts our budget, bankrupts Medicare, and deflates our economy. On top of that, it doesn't create economic stability for Arkansans. It raises their taxes. On some level, even President Obama acknowledges this won't work. He has delayed without legal recourse the employer health care mandate. More relief for other allies will certainly come. It is clear that the White House is picking and choosing who has to comply with the law, which leaves the rest of America asking, where's my exemption? Why can't everyone get a special deal? They rightfully want to know why they have to follow a law that the President's allies aren't following. Every Republican in this chamber wrote the President shortly after he made this decision to delay the employer mandate. We demanded that he extend relief to the public. In fact, we asked him to permanently delay implementation for everyone. Senator Coates and I, along with several other of our colleagues, have introduced a bill that would accomplish just that. Because this law is not just bad for U.S. businesses, it's bad for workers, it's bad for American families. The President says he's working for a better bargain for the middle class. This law crushes the middle class. It's going to make coverage unaffordable for everyone, including the very people the President seeks to provide coverage to, low-income workers. Because the law is poorly written, a worker making $21,000 a year may be offered plans with premiums that are near $2,000. How is this affordable? For a basic plan, they could also face an annual deductible upwards of $3,000 before coverage kicks in. That's almost a quarter of the annual salary of a worker making $21,000, and this is supposed to be affordable. One of my constituents hit the nail on the head during a telephone town hall that I had on Monday night when he said this law is actually making health insurance more expensive for the average person. Nowhere in the 20,000 pages of regulations can you find one that drives down the cost of health care. That's the core of the problem. This law has to be replaced with reforms that drive down the cost of health care and make insurance truly affordable for every American. Instead of allowing the government to dictate our health care needs, we should strive to reward quality health care, encourage healthy living, and minimize waste through patient choice and health care ownership. We should pass laws that expand health savings accounts. We should allow more small businesses, people like my barber, to pool together with other barbers and purchase group insurance to cover their employees at a lower rate. We need to allow Americans to purchase insurance across state lines, like we do our car insurance. And there are other reform avenues that we can explore, some, I think, that we can even get the majority and the President to support. Every Republican in this chamber wants to do away with this law. We may disagree on strategy, but we all seek the same goal. For me and many of my colleagues, it's hard to find the logic in opposing a bill that defunds Obamacare. Again, this bill that the House has sent us does exactly what we were trying to accomplish. It defunds Obamacare and keeps the government open. We must also ensure it keeps us on a path to fiscal responsibility. Now, if the majority leader attempts to restore funding for Obamacare, you can be assured that I will vote against it. My vocal opposition to the law, my record of voting against the original bill, and my support of efforts to repeal it are evidence that I want to replace this law with real reform that will drive down the cost of care and increase coverage for all. However, at the end of the day, it's not wise to force a shutdown by holding up a bill to continue the funding of government. Our troops in harm's way deserve to be paid. Seniors in Arkansas need their Social Security checks on a timely manner just to get by, and Arkansans who have jobs that require government action, regardless of the situation, will have their livelihoods at stake as a result of a shutdown. And perhaps most concerning is what a shutdown could do to the markets in this very fragile economy. Our economy is in a far more precarious position than it was during the last shutdown. The retirement and savings of millions of Arkansans could take a dramatic hit. We face a serious crisis. Healthcare costs are crippling this country, and many Americans lack access to quality, affordable care. It's stifling our nation's overall economic development. These are real difficulties patients, physicians, and hospitals face. I understand this problem firsthand. For 24 years, I practiced optometry with my brother and my partners in Arkansas. My experiences as both a health care practitioner and clinic owner led me to understand there is a right way and a wrong way to address this crisis. The President's health care is the wrong way. Let's move forward by supporting the House-passed continuing resolution that defunds Obamacare. Let's work together for affordable and effective health care reforms through free market principles. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Georgia.
Madam President, I rise to discuss the current dilemma before the Senate with regard to whether or not to vote for the motion to close debate and go to the debate and the final vote, if you will, on the House-passed version of the CR which puts in the language that defunds Obamacare. I will vote yes for cloture so we can go to the vote that I have promised my constituents in my state 57 different times in other votes I've cast in the Senate in favor of defunding the Obamacare legislation, because I believe there is a better way to do it. We only have two options before us. One is to end debate and go to a vote on legislation passed out of the House that will continue the government and defund Obamacare, understanding the leadership will have an amendment to strip the defunding out, which I will vote against that amendment because I want to be consistent with the other 57 votes I have taken. But the other alternative is an alternative not to shut off debate, to continue the debate, which means we come up to Monday night, midnight, when the fiscal year ends and the government shuts down. Government shutdowns are a bad idea. They're bad for the people that send us here to this country to represent them. They're bad for seniors on Social Security. They're bad for those whose husbands and sons and daughters are fighting in harm's way in Afghanistan and other parts of the world. It hurts our military. It hurts our health care system. And it doesn't do anything to stop Obamacare. What a lot of people don't realize is you shut the government down, you're not shutting down Obamacare. A great percentage of that is mandatory funding. If you shut the government down, you're actually encouraging Obamacare and discouraging our government to function as it should. I will not vote to shut the government down. I will vote to end the debate, and I will vote in the way that I have promised every citizen of my state since the Obamacare legislation came before us. Look, I'm on the HELP committee. We did the markup on the Affordable Care Act in 2009. Like almost every other member of the United States Senate, I was here on Christmas Eve 2009 and voted against the Obamacare legislation on the final vote. Since that period of time, we've had a plethora of votes and challenges and opportunities, and I have remained consistent. I'm not going to all of a sudden, at a debate, change my consistency and vote to shut down the government and continue Obamacare. I want to be consistent with the way I voted. I want the Senate to take up its responsibility. I want us to be sure we do not shut down the government for our people. I want to be sure everybody in the Senate has their opportunity to cast their vote, both on the continuing resolution and on whether or not Obamacare stays or whether Obamacare is defunded. That is the question before us, not whether or not we shut the government down. So while I respect and appreciate everybody's position, I just think it's irresponsible for us as a Senate to knowingly and voluntarily shut down our government and extend Obamacare when we have the opportunity to have the debate, have the vote, strip out the funding for Obamacare, and move forward as some of us have tried. I don't know how it will end up. I think I know. But I know one thing. Inaction and not voting is wrong. People of Georgia sent me here to take action, not to avoid action. They sent me here to run the government, not to shut the government down. In fact, I got to the United States Senate and the United States House because of a government shutdown, and I want to tell that story. In the 1990s, when President Clinton was president and Newt Gingrich was speaker, the issue of many issues came about on fiscal spending, and the speaker and the president and the minority and the majority leader of the Senate, Bob Dole, got in a conflict over extending the budget or not. The Republicans took the position, we'll shut the government down rather than yield to what President Clinton wanted to do. And so the government shut down. About 3 weeks later, the government was brought back. The Speaker Gingrich, came back and capitulated. We reopened the government, but he lost a lot of ground. And 2 years later, he was elected by a narrow margin, but was not reelected Speaker and resigned. I replaced him. Careful if you shut the government down. You might get another me. So that's what happens when government happens. The voters speak out. The voters make sure that we're accountable and responsible. It cost us a speakership. It cost us leadership in the House, and politically that's unsustainable and something we shouldn't do. I want to be a part of doing my responsible action, voting like I've told my voters I'm going to vote, and instead of shutting the government down, having the vote that we need to have to see to it which way we're going to move forward as a country. Madam President, I yield back the balance of my time and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will